Chapter 1. The Plunge. Yet again, the dream hauled DJ along, just a helpless passenger on a journey of despair, fear, and death. There were 4 things common to the dream. First, it was the same every time. Second, he knew all along that it was just a dream. Third, despite this knowledge, he was powerless to change anything about it. And fourth, he was going to wake up terrified, drenched in sweat, screaming at the top of his lungs, heart galloping in his chest like he had been doing wind sprints. Maybe dream was an understatement. Nightmare was closer to the truth. But DJ did not embrace the concept of fear. Calling it what it was, a nightmare, served only to give this thing more power over him than should be allowed. Fear went hand in hand with nightmares. Fear and nightmares might be his reality, but he would stubbornly refuse to acknowledge their existence until such time as he could overcome them. After all, the dream was a PTSD-induced event. While he had never been formally diagnosed, he knew it for truth. PTSD was an enemy of the mind, and like any other enemy, he would figure out a way to defeat it, eventually. But right now, it dragged him helplessly along. Right now, he was a victim. In this dream, he was standing at the edge of a cliff, surrounded by dark, foreboding skies. Steam and intense heat rose from the chasm below his feet, and flickering embers twisted their way upwards into the blackened night. He inched closer to the edge, cautiously sliding 1 foot forward so that he might lean in and look down. Burning perdition met his gaze. He was standing at the peak of what resembled a volcano, but what thrashed and churned far down inside the gaping maw was not just mere magma and superheated earth, but the clawing, raging, screaming masses of history's damned. He was looking into the very eye of hell itself. He could hear the cries of the cursed men and women of the ages. They were not pleading for help or mercy, as one might expect. They simply chanted his name in a roaring chorus of black glee. They were waiting for him, looking forward to his imminent arrival. Something stirred behind him, causing him to wheel about. His wife, who had been ripped from him so long ago. Not the fiery woman he was now married to. Cassie stood there, her pleading eyes plunging into his heart with dagger-like effect. The bullet hole that took her life still boring into her forehead. A trickle of crimson traveled in a line down next to her nose, across her lips, to drain down off her chin and splatter into the charred earth. "You failed me," she condemned him with a wavering voice. "You could have fought back, but you didn't. You raised your hands in surrender to those thugs like a whimpering coward. You didn't even bother to keep the door locked. They walked right inside, with nothing standing in their way, and look what you allowed them to do. They killed me. They murdered me right in front of you, right in front of our children. How could you?" Unbridled regret ravaged itself upon DJ. That whole event suddenly replaying itself like a horror show stuck on loop. His wife lying next to him. The bullet fired by the invader entering her head again and again. His own screams echoing in his head. That moment had plucked his will to live from his soul like a flower from a vine. It only got worse from there. "Daddy?" 2 tiny voices spoke in stereo. The call of his twin girls yanked him from his memory, and he was returning to the smoldering summit, his back to the heated precipice. Standing off to one side were his twin girls, just mere toddlers when the same home invaders took their lives as well, blood-stained outfits covering their small bodies. The shades of his girls looked at him with unmeasured sadness in their eyes. "What's it like to grow up?" He turned his head between his wife and his daughters, heart breaking in two, as if their deaths had only just occurred, instead of years past. "I'm so sorry," he whispered to the ghosts. "I failed you both." His dead wife nodded, her face now clouded with scorn, And then you have the audacity to go and start a new life and a new family. It's like we never existed." "No," he shouted. "That's not true. You told me to move on. You came to me in a vision. You told me you liked Abby." She shook her head. "Visions? There are no such things as visions. You merely conjured up your own selfish desires in your dreams and used that as justification to forget about us. You failed us in both life and death. How could you?" His daughters spoke in unison once more, yanking his attention back to the other side of the cliff. "If we had been allowed to grow up, would we have followed in your shoes? Would we have been a failure too, Daddy?" His grief took him to his knees. He knew it was a dream, but it still drove him into the charred ground of his twisted imagination as if it were real. "I didn't mean to," he whispered. Another voice now spoke, another ghost from his past, but this one more recent. "Man," MP exclaimed, drawing DJ's attention. Marion Peters, the dead FBI agent and co-worker, stood before him like a human boulder. He was short in stature, but possessing an abundance of muscles. Mighty Pebble, DJ had lovingly referred to him while he was still alive. He was planted right in front of DJ, between the others, an accusing stare on his face and fists on his hips. "You just keep racking up the kills, don't you? First your family, and then your friends." DJ shook his head and tried to argue. "No, I didn't kill you." "You didn't pull the trigger, so that's how you abandon your guilt?" MP cocked his head to one side. "I followed you. I should have cut my losses with you and ran far away after you nearly got me killed during that snowstorm." MP was referencing their first encounter when on the run from El Gran Blanco, the psychotic assassin with a personal beef against DJ. The event had almost claimed MP's life. He survived, however, and followed DJ into recruitment with the FBI. "But no," he continued, "I didn't learn my lesson. Chaos and death follow you wherever you go, and I was stupid enough to tag along anyway. I followed you right through the door on that roof, right into the path of the bullet that was meant for you. Should have been you. Now I'm just another piece of human debris that you left behind." As DJ watched, a bullet ripped through MP's neck on one side, destroying a carotid artery, and blood sprayed out in a macabre fountain of red. MP didn't even flinch or try to stop the blood flow. He just stood there, shaking his head in disgust. DJ made to leap forward, but the ghost stopped him with a wave of his hand, dismissing DJ's intention and rooting him in place against the cliff's edge. "I'm so sorry," DJ whispered again. The gathered ghosts before him spoke as one. Yes, you are sorry. But what are we? We are dead. And it's all your fault." They were charging forward then, wrath on their faces and fire in their eyes as hot as the heat from Hell's Maw behind them. There was nowhere to run. There was no fight in him to resist. Over the cliff he went, shoved backwards by the shades of those he cared about. Tumbling end over end, he plummeted, the rage of hell charring him as he descended into the pit. He closed his eyes and waited for the end, to be consumed by the inferno that waited at the bottom. He deserved his fate. Part of him looked forward with eager anticipation to the cleansing flames. The other part of him screamed in overwhelming fear of such a horrible death, to be tortured by burning alive, only to never actually die. It would be pain unending, an eternal penance for his failures. He twisted and spun as he fell, his vision becoming a collage of confusion, unable to tell the difference between up and down. Soon, he thought, soon I'll be at the bottom, in the place that I deserve, where I belong. But the other part of him knew what would happen as soon as he arrived at the bottom. He would be jolted from this journey and back into the world of the living. He would awaken screaming, still at the bottom, but not in the raging pit of his dream, in the stark reality that he must live with his past and his actions. But then, oddly, this dream became different. It shifted. There was something original to this iteration. Instead of increasing heat as he approached the flames, it was becoming colder and windy. The previous versions lacked the wind rushing past his ears from his fall. This version had it suddenly present in a roaring so intense that it filled him. It drove a biting cold into him that chilled him to the bone. The time in freefall was different too. He was continuing to fall when he should have struck the bottom by now. He was confused. Suddenly. Very confused. He should be awake now, shouting his fear in a cold sweat as he was ripped from his terror-filled dream world. Falling. Tumbling. Confusion. Fear. Stabbing cold. With a desperate focus of effort, he opened his eyes. Really opened them. Not in his dream state, but in a violent awaking to his surroundings. He remembered. It came crashing into him in a flood that washed away the dream and slammed him into reality. He had been drugged. He had been at his home, headed to do a little 3-gun drill work at his homemade range behind the house. He had needed to clear his head. But somebody had wrecked those plans. They had been lurking in the woods waiting, and hit him in the neck with a drug-filled dart. As the unknown chemicals pulled him into the darkness, he was sure that someone wanted him alive. They would torture him for information. About what, he had no idea. It would probably be related to his time in the FBI. He was also sure of something else. Taking him alive was going to prove a serious mistake. As soon as he could figure out what all of this was about, he would kill them. Every one of them. Because that seemed to be the only thing he was any good at. Killing. Both villains and loved ones alike. Torture and information. This was the reason someone had drugged him. He had been sure of it. But now, a grisly death seemed to be more the motivation. He was in freefall, and from a great height. Not a cliff like in his dream, but from somewhere higher. Much higher. By now, he would have surely struck the ground if he had been tossed off a building. His fall time had been too long. From what he had been thrown, or how long he had left before impact, he had no clue. The world was night. Black night, with almost no visibility. He could see no clouds, stars, ground, or sky. The biting cold driven by the incredible wind rushing past him said that he must be outside. But where was he? When he had been captured, it had been late summer. Not quite fall. The air here was too cold for this time of year. Had he been asleep that long? All these things spun around in his brain, just like his body did now in freefall. But he was having trouble sorting them out. He couldn't think clearly. There was still an unknown drug in his system, blunting his ability to think. A plane. Somewhere in the corners of his brain, he remembered being loaded into a plane of some kind. He had been stirring to life and struggling to fight the drugs. He had caught a bit of conversation in a language he couldn't understand. As he managed to pry his eyelids open, he captured a glimpse of his surroundings. He was lying on a hard surface. It was night. He was next to a plane. Not a big one. Not a small one either. Something with a cargo door in the back, like a C-130, only smaller. Someone looked down from above him. One of the ones who had been talking in that thick accent. Russian, maybe? They looked down at him and saw his eyes were open. The man had been holding a syringe as he talked. He had been ready. DJ had not noticed it in the man's hand until his captor knelt quickly and stabbed DJ in the neck again. A stabbing pain, and then he was gone, slipping away into unconsciousness once more. He had been thrown from that plane, he reasoned. What a wicked way to kill someone. And a bizarre way, no doubt. Why not simply ambush DJ with a bullet to his skull instead of a knockout dart to his neck, only to then drop him out of the back of a plane? Seems like a real weird way to do it, he thought, tumbling through the air. Unless the intent had been for him to contemplate his demise all the way down. But why not wake him up, monologue to him about his misdeeds, and explain what was about to happen before tossing him from a plane? At least tell DJ why this elaborate death had been planned for him. Right now, he was just confused. Over and over he tumbled endlessly into the night, downward towards his death, confused, alone, and thinking of Abby and his unborn child. Who would take care of them now? He closed his eyes and waited for the end. At least it would be quick. A voice spoke loud enough to be heard above the roar of the wind. A woman's voice, repeating itself. Somewhere close, but mechanical, like a recording played across speakers. That same language. Definitely Russian. "Disyet," she said twice. DJ tried to force clarity into his brain and figure out what was really going on here. He looked around, rushing wind and cold stinging his eyes, seeing nothing but black night. Where did the recording come from? And now a beeping noise in a steady rhythm, loud enough so that he could clearly make it out over the sound of the wind, somewhere below his ears. He slapped at his chest and suddenly understood that maybe he was not going to die as he first assumed. He was wearing something. A thick harness of some kind covered his chest. His fumbling fingers found a hard, rectangular box mounted right in the middle. It must be the source of the beeping, and maybe the voice that had spoken. His probing hands raced across his body and confirmed his suspicions. He was wearing a parachute. His chemically inebriated brain was only just now figuring this out. Whoever had thrown him from the plane had intended that he survive. But how does one open a parachute? He racked his sluggish brain for the answer. The disembodied voice spoke again. "Payet Tisiech," she said twice. He did not speak the language, but the dialect certainly sounded Russian. He had no idea what Payet Tisiech meant, but he deduced it to be bad news. The beeping noise suddenly picked up its pace, running at twice the speed that it had prior to the woman's announcement. It's a countdown, he realized. When the little Russian woman in the box on his chest got done counting, he was going to end up splattered everywhere. He needed to figure out how to open the chute. His hands clawed around, looking for a handle to pull. Didn't they all have a handle? He needed to stop cartwheeling through the air. He knew enough from hearsay of those that had jumped before that if you were tumbling when a chute deployed, it could cause the whole thing to tangle. If your chute is tangled, you died. But how was he supposed to stop flipping around like he was? He had no experience with any of this. With almost zero visibility, he didn't even know which way was up. Whatever drug was still flowing through his veins had him struggling to think clearly. And where was that stupid handle anyway? "Chitidi tisyechi," the mechanical voice said. "Razvinub sholub." The beeping went from a racing cadence to a steady tone. This could not be good. He felt all over the harness, looking for anything to help him out. There was a fabric-covered bulge at his waist. There was a much bigger one attached to his back. Still, he could feel no handle across the surface of the bulge in front, or anywhere he could reach behind him. There had to be one, but in the dark, he couldn't see or feel anything that resembled a handle or pin to pull. Buffeting wind battered him in the face, taking his breath away and burning his eyes. He could feel his heart racing as panic began to set in. He was about to be turned into a flat, gooey mess. The robotic female voice made another announcement. "Divadid Piatsa, Razvertvanyi Ziv Yolba." The steady tone then went back to a beeping, rapidly picking up pace as time marched on. He had to be close to death now. He was out of time. His panicking fingers pressed in between the bulge at his waist and his belly. Instead of searching for something to pull on top, looking for where the bulge was attached to the harness, they closed around something. A loop of metal, clearly bent around in a sort of triangle. The pin he was looking for. With his left hand, in desperation, he latched onto the bulge in a death grip. With his right, he made to yank the retaining pin with everything he had in him. Flashback. In the span of heartbeats, he raced back in time to a conversation he had been having with a guy who had been in the Army, an infantryman. The man had been in the Rangers and was jump qualified, as all Rangers were. He and DJ had been swapping stories in an airport lounge, DJ drinking coffee and the Ranger sipping beer. The man had a limp, and DJ, a Navy corpsman at the time, questioned him on his injury. "Funny story," the man had said. "I was on a halo insertion, high-altitude jump with a breathing tank. I deployed my chute right on time, but it opened wrong and got all twisted. I pulled my reserve almost immediately, but lost my grip. See, your reserve chute is located in front. You're supposed to grab it hard and pull the retaining pin. The whole handle comes loose in your hand. There are straps still attaching you to the thing, of course, but the chute itself is in this bag you're now holding. Next, you're supposed to toss it away from you as hard as you can. I didn't have a good grip on it, and it slipped right out of my hand as soon as I pulled it free." DJ shook his head. "I don't get it. Shouldn't it still open?" The man nodded, taking another sip of his beer. "Oh, yeah, sure. But see, whenever you have to pull your reserve, it's because the main has failed. It's being towed along somewhere above you. The idea is to make sure the reserve doesn't get tangled up with the main. So you push it away from you as hard as you can to minimize the risk. I didn't get that chance. It slipped free and deployed straight into my main above. It was a worst-case scenario. The two twisted together." DJ remembered being shocked at hearing the story. "But you're still here. You're still alive. How?" "Well, both caused enough drag to slow me down. The trees did the rest. I broke my left leg in 3 places. A few ribs, too. Both arms. But the real damage happened in my left leg. Shattered it like glass. Got 38 pins holding it all together. Pretty messed up. Been in rehab for like 3 years now." "Man, I'm so sorry," DJ told him. He remembered the man shrugging it all away as he sipped his beer. "I'm still here. I still serve. Army made me reclass to another MOS, and I'm a paper pusher now. But it is what it is. Every day is still a fight, just like before. I just do it on a different battlefield." Back in the here and now, DJ yanked the pin free with an adrenaline-fueled pull. The bulge of canvas at his belly detached, but DJ gripped it hard. He let go of the pin in his right hand, readjusted to grab the bundle hard with both, and shoved it away from him with everything he had. For a moment, he could feel a tugging on the harness, as what he imagined to be cords unwound from the bundle as it shot out into the darkness. The beeping noise had increased in speed until it was now a solid tone. On his back, there was a loud pop and more tugging, this time from behind. "Oh, crap," DJ thought, as understanding slammed home. The main chute behind him must have been outfitted with some sort of auto-deployment device. That must have been what the Russian woman had been going on about. She had been notifying him that she was about to pull the chute for him. He had unwittingly placed himself in the same predicament as the Army Ranger did that DJ had met in the airport lounge so long ago. There were now 2 chutes being deployed at once. They were going to tangle. He was going to kill himself while trying to save himself. The irony was like a sucker punch to the face. Several things happened in a rush. He heard the chutes opening with a gigantic rustling of fabric. Simultaneously, a tremendous jerk on the harness whipped him into an upright position, causing him to feel like the end of a towel getting snapped in a locker room. Dizziness washed over him, and nausea drove bile to the back of his throat. He was sure the drugs had something to do with it, but he stubbornly made to choke it back down. He failed. In a great upheaval of his innards, he belched a stream of vomit outward. He felt it coat his chin and land on the front of his harness and clothing. He took a breath from his sudden straining and then did it all over again. He could feel it splatter all over him as he was forced to upchuck in a virtual standing position instead of bent over like one would normally be. He closed his eyes and gasped for breath, willing the nausea to retreat. After a moment or two of heavy breathing, mouth open, gulping in the cold night air, it retreated. Someone was going to pay for all of this, he vowed. Somewhere above him the clouds broke, and a pale shaft of moonlight blanketed him in a sudden gray light. He turned his head upwards to find it. Stretching above him, cords for 2 parachutes split into twin groups. Both had successfully opened and were side by side, one rectangular, the other round. They bounced off one another, and he got the distinct impression that he was now descending at a slower rate than normal. He felt like one of those space capsules returning to Earth with multiple chutes. Widening his gaze, he tried to take in his surroundings, finally able to see something for the first time. The sky was covered in a blanket of thick clouds, save for the single hole that allowed moonlight to stab through. As he looked, other holes in the sky began to appear. First one, then another, and another. The clouds were breaking as he watched. Something in the far distance caught his attention. Another chute. Someone else was falling to the earth. And another. A second figure was dangling from a parachute even further away. Were these yet more victims of the same treachery that had befallen him? He squinted, trying to make out details, but they were still too far away. A third chute and figure appeared out of the darkness in his peripheral and to his right. What in the world was going on? His mind was catapulted away from that question in an instant. In his intense focus of the other 3 parachutes, he failed to look in the one direction where he should have concentrated first. Down. He was now plummeting through the outstretched arms of tree limbs. The smell of evergreens assaulted his nostrils as boughs snapped under his weight. He crunched into a ball as best he could, and instinctively brought his arms up to shield his face. Downward he went, crashing and tearing through the trees. Limbs stabbed at him and his clothing, and flesh tore under the attack. Another violent jerk halted his descent, and gave him that towel-like snap once more. His chutes had encountered the canopy, and his momentum was reduced to 0 in an instant. The harness pushed into his groin, and he grunted from the pain. A fresh bout of nausea struck him, and he closed his eyes, struggling to fight it off. A moment or two of breathing, and the feeling subsided. He cautiously opened his eyes to take in his surroundings. Nothing. Inky blackness shielded his vision. Above him, the moon was either hidden by cloud cover once more, or the blanket of evergreens above him were so thick that they prevented any light from filtering down to him. Either way, it was the proverbial, could not see the hand in front of your face. He reached out, pawing into the black, feeling around for a tree limb to latch onto. He only encountered empty space. He was dangling in a void like a broken, human piñata. Around him he could hear things. Forest things. A breeze stirred the treetops above his head, but he felt none of it down here. He caught the sound of an owl far away calling into the night. Insects began to slowly start singing. They weren't there to begin with, but now they were growing in volume. He had likely silenced them as he came crashing down from above. He smelled pines and the soft aroma of dirt. He was surrounded by the smells and sounds of a forest, but he couldn't see nor touch any of it. It was like it was all a figment of his imagination. Except for the cold. There was a biting chill in the stagnant air. That was 100% real. He needed to be on the ground and feel good old Mother Earth under his feet. But how far above the ground was he? Inches? Feet? Was he dangling over the edge of a deep chasm? He needed to see. If only that moon would punch through again. If only he had some source of light. His watch. He grabbed at his left wrist and discovered that his watch was still latched onto him. He eagerly stabbed the button on the face of the cheap LED timepiece that would illuminate the surface and allow him to see the numbers. He was a little old-fashioned in that he believed in the necessity of a watch. In a world of smartphones, many preferred to rely on that one device to handle timekeeping as well. He preferred a good old-fashioned watch. He always had one. A cheap one, to be sure. But he always had one that was impact-resistant and waterproof. And he never took it off, even to shower. He would wear it either until the surface was too scarred to see the numbers, or the battery failed. Only then would he remove it so that it could be replaced. The soft blue glow illuminated the face and told him it was a little past 3 a.m. While the glow was intense in such a deep surrounding darkness, it still did not provide enough light for him to make out any of his surroundings. He needed more. He shook his head attempting to clear the remaining drug-induced fog that impeded him from thinking. He needed to inventory himself and check his injuries. He was certain he had only suffered minor scratches and bruises. But was there anything in his pockets? Did his captors leave him with anything to use once he landed on the ground? Did he have any of his possessions that were on him at the time of his attack, other than his watch? With a sudden burst of hope and adrenaline, he reached for his weapon. The modified Sig Sauer P320 X5 series he had purchased to replace the weapon he lost to the Atlantic Ocean. He missed Mitch, the name he had given the lost gun, something fierce. The new one still had no name yet, and he was only starting to develop that relationship. He clawed at his hip, hoping against all odds that it would be there to meet his grasp. Nothing. It was foolish to have thought his enemy would have given him a weapon, but he needed to check. If not his gun, what about his knives? DJ always carried more than one knife on his person. One was clipped into his right front pocket, a simple spring-assisted, powder-coated job with a 4-inch blade. He used it for anything he might encounter in his daily life. As expected, when he put his hand to where it would be, he found it to be missing. The second was a thin, weighted stiletto he kept strapped to the inside of his left ankle, a backup knife for combat purposes, useless now that he was no longer in the FBI. After all, his only aspirations were on becoming a good father and not defeating enemies while under cover. But he was a creature of habit. With a grunt, he lifted his leg and grabbed at it with both hands. Missing, of course. The third was a short and stubby, single-edged blade hidden into the backside of his belt buckle as part of its design. It was too short to be functional for much, and was intended for emergency situations only. This constituted an emergency as far as DJ was concerned, and he hesitantly reached for his waist, fearing the worst. Bingo. His hand found the familiar buckle, and his belt still in place. Whoever had done all of this to him had missed that little detail, thinking it only a belt. This was the first thing that had gone his way since this whole ordeal had begun. The thing was billed as a survival belt when he purchased it. The strap portion was constructed of a flat black composite material that did not stretch or sag, providing good support for his sidearm. The buckle had two functions. The first was to hold the stubby emergency knife on one side. The second was to hide a ferrocerium fire starter rod on the other. One could take the flat side of the knife, strike it against the short rod, and a shower of sparks would fly free. Apply those sparks to some tinder, and you could get a fire going. Something he intended to do to ward off the cold and shed some light on his surroundings as soon as he could free himself from his current situation. He silently shamed himself for being frugal and not springing for the upgraded version that included a tiny compass and LED flashlight. Both would come in handy right now. But the situation was what it was. He would use the tools at hand and be thankful that he had them. DJ freed the knife and the rod, positioning them in each hand. He struck one against the other with a glancing blow, and a tiny shower of sparks thrust into the night away from him. The immediate area was illuminated in a flash by thin, flickering yellow light, but was almost instantly gone. It had been enough for him to take in the area, however. He was surrounded by tree trunks. Conifers, all of them. He could tell by their bark, and, of course, the intense smell of pine. Another strike, and he took in more of his surroundings, this time looking down. The forest floor was virtually devoid of undergrowth, covered in thick pine straw and the dead limbs and twigs shed from the canopy above. This could only mean that the forest rooftop was so thick that sunlight rarely made it down this far for plant life to flourish. This was probably good news. It would offer him some shelter and concealment until he could figure out what was going on and how to get out of here. Better still was the fact that he was only about 8 feet above it. Not a long drop if he cut himself free from his chutes. Yet again, he struck the ferrocerium rod, focusing his attention above. The treetops were too far away to reflect any light, the flickering yellow glow unable to penetrate the canopy. But after a second and third strike, he was able to make out sets of complex buckles attaching his harness to the parachute cords. He tucked the knife and rod back into the buckle and set to work on them, his fingers probing and pulling in the complete absence of light, searching for the way to spring himself free. Finally, with a metallic snick, the one on his right broke loose. He dropped free to hang only from the one to the left, dangling, swaying, and twisting from the sudden motion. With his body now listing over to one side, he could no longer reach the remaining clasp. He struggled and stretched, causing himself to swing back and forth like a pendulum. It was no use. He simply could not reach it. He snatched the stubby knife from his buckle once more and began sawing on the strap. He could hear the thing slowly separating as the sharp edge cut through the thick straps. Little by little, he drove the blade through the strap until, with a snap, he dropped to the forest floor. He had not been quite ready, and when he struck the ground, his ankle rolled. Piercing pain drove into him, and down he went, a sharp stick scraping his cheek next to his eye. He could feel the blood start to flow, and knew that he had narrowly avoided being blinded. Rolling over, he brought his leg up and began massaging his ankle while laying on the ground. It was a pretty bad sprain. He could already feel it beginning to swell. He needed to get a look at it. He needed to see, period. Time to start working on the fire. He would ignore the pain and focus on the more pressing need. First, he wanted freedom from the harness. It took him a few minutes of fumbling around in the dark, rolling around on the ground with his wounded leg. But eventually he managed to shed the harness that had attached him to the parachute. Finally uncumbered, he next focused on the creation of a fire. Getting to his knees, he began pulling and raking handfuls of pine straw toward him. As he did, he pulled out any sticks and piled them on his right-hand side. Once he could get a flame going with the pine needles, he would add in the sticks until he could forage around for larger stuff. The mound of straw he piled on his left. He dug down into the ground in front of him, moving the straw out of the way until he could feel the texture change and become slightly damp. The last thing he wanted to do was set the entire forest on fire. He knew from his time living in the piney woods section of East Texas that pine straw eventually became thick enough that it turned into a compost of sorts. He needed to position his fire in a ring of that damp material, lest it spread. He would also need to keep the fire small. A large one could send embers into the surrounding forest, and the whole thing could get out of hand quickly. He didn't want to survive being hurled from an airplane, only to burn himself alive by being stupid. Once he had a large enough space cleared out and his materials gathered in position, he set about making a bird's nest out of the pine straw. He molded and shaped a large handful of the stuff, twisting and folding it until it resembled a kind of bowl or a bird's nest. His ankle throbbed with a steady rhythm. It was a severe sprain. It would seriously cause him problems going forward. He needed to pop his boot off and relieve the pressure, but he needed that warmth first. The temperature was really dropping. As he shaped his bowl, he was keenly aware that he was on a sloped surface, likely the side of a hill. Another good sign, he hoped. He had no food and water. He could live without food for a while, but it was doubtful he would have to. He was certain he could survive off of whatever the forest had to offer. However, finding water was imperative. 3 or 4 days was all he could go without, and then his body would shut down and die. A sloped surface in the presence of hills would give him a direction to go when it got light enough to see. He would head downhill. With luck, he would encounter a stream. With better luck, a road. Although it was unlikely that whoever had chucked him out of that plane would have done so close to a road and a chance of escape. He placed the bird's nest in the corner of the cleared-out area and set about trying to start his fire. He struck his starter rod, and sparks shot into the nest. They smoldered and glowed for a moment, but no amount of gentle blowing could get them to coax the straw into catching fire. After a few attempts, he knew he needed something even thinner than the hardy pine needles. With his knife, he trimmed off a piece of his shirt. Blinded in the chilled dark, he began pulling at the fabric and separating the threads, forming a small ball of frayed cloth that should catch fire easier than the tough pine straw. It was getting colder. At first, it had been only a chill, made worse as he had been hurtling through the sky. But even under the thick shelter of these woods, It was obvious that a cold front was moving in. The still air made it feel like he was kneeling in a refrigerator. Where was he? He had to be somewhere much further north than his home in Texas. It was still early for this kind of cold. It shouldn't be this cold for another 2 months or so. Was it possible that he'd been out for that long? He doubted it, although his grumbling stomach informed him that he had been without a meal for a while. Finally, he formed the fabric into a loose ball, his fingers starting to numb despite the effort. Patting around in the dark, he located the bird's nest and placed it in the middle. It took 3 attempts to land a few embers into the ball of thread, but with a gentle puff of air from his pursed lips, it quickly developed into a small flame. In just a few minutes, he had a decent-sized blaze going, adding the smaller sticks on top to grow the fire larger. Glancing around his surroundings, he located a larger piece of dead wood nearby, as big around as his wrist. Crawling over, he swung it against a tree trunk and snapped it in half. He used both pieces to form 2 parallel barriers for his campfire, and started laying more sticks across the top. Blessed heat began to drive away the cold. With a good fire going for warmth and light, he set about tending to his swollen ankle, freeing it from his laced boot. It was in bad shape, purple, red, and swollen. Not good. It would make hiking through these woods a challenge. Massaging his leg, he went back to racking his brain, trying to figure out what was going on. He was somewhere far from home, dropped into a wilderness with no supplies. Why? To what end? And the other shoots he saw, were those allies or foes? Were they people in a similar situation as he? He thought about the 2 chutes he had to help him fall to the earth. Had he not used the backup chute along with the main, chances are he would have fallen in closer proximity to the other 3. The extra chute had produced additional drag and made him take a different path down than the others. He counted himself fortunate. Until he knew where he was, why he was here, and who those other 3 were, he preferred to be alone. But why keep him in the dark about what was going on? Wouldn't an enemy want him to know why they had gone through such trouble to do all of this? If this was some sort of payback for something he had done, would not his enemy want to lecture him about why he was here? Isn't that what villains did? He needed another clue. He turned his attention to the harness he had been wearing. He dragged it closer to the flames for further examination, and was now more certain than ever the voice he had heard on his way down was Russian. Looking down at the electronic box housing the speaker, he could see Russian writing on the front of it, with its crazy backwards letters and foreign symbols. Why would the Russians be after him? And if they were, why not torture him for any information they wanted, or simply shoot him if this was an assassination attempt? And then he knew. It all made sense now. Past the pain in his ankle, past the remnants of some unknown drug still rendering his brain sluggish and making him feel drunk, past the confusion of these events, it all snapped into place. Ivan Romanov, Sergei's brother. This had to be because of him. It was payback. Ivan had blamed the Americans in general for the death of Sergei. In retaliation, he had funded a terrorist who had tried to use a stolen nuclear weapon on U.S. soil. Ivan must have hoped that all the blame would be placed on the terrorist. DJ's group had uncovered Ivan as the financing source, however. When DJ had quit, the matter had been taken up by other agencies to decide what to do about it. Foreign relations with the Russians were always tricky, and DJ had just assumed sanctions against Ivan and those in his network would be issued, and that would be the end of it. It apparently was not the end of it, as far as Ivan had been concerned. Somehow, the Russian gangster had learned of DJ's involvement with the failed terrorist attempt and the death of Sergei. DJ had not killed the man's brother, of course, but that is not how the rumors were spread through the criminal underworld. It had been a part of DJ's undercover profile as a killer for hire that he was responsible. It looked like that had now come back to bite him. DJ still didn't understand the purpose of dropping him in the middle of nowhere. Did this mean the other figures he saw descending from the heavens were members of his old team? If so, he needed to find them and join forces. There were still too many unanswered questions in all of this. But who was behind it? DJ now had no doubts. DJ spotted a small canvas bag attached to the back of the harness next to where the rear chute had been. Hope sprung in him, and he tore into it. Maybe there were some supplies he could use. A power bar, or maybe a canteen of water, would come in handy about now. In the flickering light of the fire, he was rewarded with seeing something that brought him both hope and dread at the same time. His gun. The very same one he had been wearing when he had been captured. Ripping it from the bag, he found it still loaded with the 21-round magazine he had equipped it with. He looked deeper in the bag, running his hand through the inside. Nothing else. Only the pistol and the one magazine. There could only be one reason why his captors would have given him this. He was being challenged. His skill against others. He now knew who those other chutes belonged to. They were hunters. He was to be their prey. Why else would he have been given back his weapon, if not for the chance to defend himself? He smiled for the first time since awakening. Ivan Romanov had decided to give him a fighting chance. The Russian had heard all the stories about DJ being incredibly good with a gun. He was now giving DJ the chance to prove it. This knowledge gave him insight into his adversary. The gangster was filled with pride, and like the good book said, pride cometh before the fall. DJ shoved the harness aside and turned back to the fire. His next thoughts went to Abby. Was she safe? He had to trust that she was. When he last spoke to her, she was in the hospital. She was surrounded by people and security cameras. It was doubtful the Russians would have risked going for her, too, lest they be discovered. In the end, it didn't matter. He needed to shove aside all worry and fear. He had a job to do. He had to survive whatever came next. He needed to kill or evade his hunters. Once that was done, he would move back to the next task at hand. Get back to civilization. After that, the direction was clear. Rid the world of Ivan Romanov. DJ soaked in the warmth of the fire, tossing another stick to add to the fuel. Then, with purpose, he began disassembling his weapon and checking it for serviceability, like he had done countless times before any other mission. Ivan Romanov was prideful and stupid. He was used to getting his way, always coming out on top. DJ had read enough of his profile to learn who he was, to know that Ivan liked to make examples of people, to use them as advertising for his reputation, and to strike fear in the hearts of his enemies. The gangster was doing the same thing with DJ that he had always done when encountering annoying problems. But with DJ, he had bitten off more than he could chew. The notorious Russian just didn't know it yet. He should have just killed DJ when he had the opportunity. It was a mistake of titanic proportions, and DJ would not let him have another. The man had given DJ a fighting chance, all to prove he was the baddest thug on the block. But he had never encountered anyone like DJ Slaughter. The Russian had unknowingly overreached. DJ started life like any other guy next door, but fate and fury had changed him. DJ had been forged by the fires of life and circumstances to become something different. He was focused and committed like few others when he made a decision. And above all, he was lethal. As lethal as they came. DJ did not choose this particular battle. It had been chosen for him. He accepted this reality. His decision had been made. Somewhere far away was his wife and unborn child. Abby was probably worried sick over his disappearance. But he buried all thoughts of her deep into the back of his mind. If he wanted to survive this and see her again, he would have to forget about her. There was no room for her in his thoughts. Here, there was only the hunter and the hunted. It would be all that consumed him. DJ smiled into the flames as he reassembled his gun. He was suffering from PTSD. He knew it. He would have to try and deal with it at some point. But for now, Ivan Romanov had given him the best distraction possible for his mental illness. He had given DJ a target to shoot at. He slapped the magazine home and loaded a round into the chamber. In any other moment, the action might have been a bit cliché. But for DJ, it was like hearing the gavel of a judge slam down during sentencing. It was satisfying. He could not wait to finally have something to shoot at. It would come tomorrow, he was sure. He would be prepared. He would be eager. He was eager already. He tucked MP into his belt and went back to massaging his ankle. He grinned. Well, at least he had a name for his gun now. "Thanks, Ivan," he spoke out loud. "You helped me finally decide on a name. And it's a fitting one. Can't wait to introduce you." Special Agent in Charge Brett Allen Foster sat in his wheelchair, slicing an apple, happily munching away as if it were the tastiest thing on the planet. Across from him, sitting in a steel chair, wrists shackled to the simple table that was bolted to the floor between them, Ismail Elwan El-Karbuli watched with obvious disdain. Brett knew that the terrorist before him had only been provided peanut butter sandwiches and water since his incarceration at this facility over a month ago. He inwardly smiled as he placed another thin wedge of the sweet fruit between his teeth. No matter how hardened the murderer was before him, Brett knew the man could not help but covet the apple, or anything else at this point, due to his restrictive diet. Brett had been at this interrogation for 3 days. So far, Ismail had not sown any cracks in his resolve to sit silently. Brett needed answers. He needed them sooner rather than later. He had asked repeated questions concerning the Russian financier of the attack on America. He asked about the identity of the impersonators that had pretended to be Brett and his entourage, and just what they had said to him when alone together. The man had remained silent through it all. The Saudis had tried beating the terrorist with a hose in order to get him to talk. They had waterboarded him for hours. They had not tried drugging him yet, but only because Brett had insisted against it. He knew that information gained from drugs was often flawed. He needed accurate intel if he was going to make heads or tails of what was really going on. So, today, he was trying a new approach. Brett was sure the Russians were behind whomever it was that had pretended to be him and gained access to Ismail. They were the only ones with the capabilities to eavesdrop in on American communications and learn that it was Brett who would be coming to pay a visit. The Chinese could have pulled the same trick, but as the mobster they were dealing with was Russian, there could be no other real choice. But Brett did not need Ismail to tell him that. He needed the killer to give up the reason why the Russians felt the need to make such a risky and direct contact with him. He needed to know what information the terrorist had given them. He needed to know if the Russian government had sanctioned such an action, or if it was the mobster alone that had made such a move. There was something big going on here, and Brett needed to know what it was. Hence the apple. Brett had decided to attack the man through his stomach. Brett moaned with delight over the deliciousness of the large red fruit. "I have to tell you, Ismail, no other country in the world can grow an apple quite like us Americans. Other nations have apple trees, sure, but they all pale in comparison to what we have been able to produce. For a few hundred years now, Americans have used their embracing of capitalism to massage the simple apple into something truly spectacular. We've crossed different species of fruit to figure out how to make the biggest, sweetest apples in the entire world. We even manipulate it through genetics. We can now make them last longer in storage, so we can ship them around the world before they have a chance to spoil. I was really surprised to discover that the guards here are snacking on apples grown in Georgia. Amazing when you think about it." Brett stared intently at the next slice, admiring the color and texture of the fruit in his fingers. But from the edge of his vision, he noticed a slight movement from his adversary. The man up until now had been a rock of resolve, a nut that could not be cracked. But that little squirm told Brett that the only thing Ismail could think about right now was the apple. That and maybe the small folding knife Brett was using to carve it up. He was sure the man would love nothing more than to be plunging it right into Brett's neck. "I don't get it, Izzy," Brett said, looking the man in the eye and leaning back. "I already know it was the Russians that came to see you. I already know that Romanov financed you. I even know why they did it. It was an act of vengeance for the death of Sergei. Ivan used you to accomplish his goals. It was his idea and his money. But you're the one taking the fall for his crimes. Why? What loyalty do you have to him at this point? All I'm asking for you to do is confirm a few additional suspicions I have, and to know why they came to talk with you. Give me the tiniest bit of information and I can make the beating stop. No more waterboarding. No more sleep deprivation. I can make it all go away. You're doing Romanov no favors by remaining silent. We're going after him anyway. So why keep silent?" Ismail said nothing, only shifted in his chair a bit. It was his eyes, however, that told Brett everything he needed to know. Ismail was staring at the apple. Brett spun his chair and wheeled his way to the door. He tapped on the steel surface twice, and then backed out of the way. The door opened to reveal 2 armed Saudi guards in their desert camouflage and traditional dark green berets. "How much longer?" Brett asked. "This apple's just not doing it. I haven't had a bite to eat for several hours." Standing in the doorway, one of the guards pulled a portable radio from his belt and spoke into it in his native language. After a moment, a reply crackled across the small speaker in the same. "I am told they are on the way," the dark-skinned man with brooding eyes said, glancing at the captive across the room. Brett nodded and spun back to face the terrorist. He heard the door click close behind him, and he simply stared at Ismail, forcing a look of consideration across his face. Finally, he pushed his way back to the table, but not before tossing the half-eaten apple into a wastepaper basket stationed in the corner. Brett inwardly grinned as Ismail's eyes tracked the apple in flight until it vanished from view with a chunk against the metal bottom. Everything in this facility was hard, cold, and drab. The ceilings, walls, and flooring were all concrete. The doors were steel. Trash bins were steel. Desks, tables, and chairs were all steel. So was anything else that was not concrete, it seemed. Even the toilets were formed of brushed stainless. There was not a single soft thing to be found here, save the blankets allowed to the prisoners at night. Even then, they slept on the hard floor. All of it was colored in pale greens and grays, and lit by LED lighting that was uncovered and harsh to look at. Just being here was demoralizing. It was designed to depress the occupants just from visuals alone. This whole place was fashioned for one purpose: make anyone forced to be here uncomfortable and miserable. Brett wasn't sure how the guards and administrators tolerated it. Maybe that was on purpose too. It would serve to make the captors even more brutal and uncaring of their charges. "I have to be honest," Brett said. "Even now, we don't really know too much about you. Your past is vague at best. We think we know where your home was, where you grew up, but we aren't sure. We don't know how you came to learn English, though it is not uncommon for the educated in the Mideast to learn English in school. We don't know why your hatred for America is so strong. Was it through some teaching by an imam in some unknown mosque? Did our military kill one of your family members? We just aren't sure. Not to mention, we certainly have no idea how you managed to hook up with Ivan Romanov. I can't even figure out why you would want to partner with him anyway. Unless we are completely wrong about your past. Aren't you originally from Afghanistan? Don't you guys hate the Russians?" Ismail sat stone-faced and silent, staring at Brett with disgust flickering in his eyes. Brett leaned back, folding his arms. "All right, Izzy, you win. I get it. You're a tough guy. You can take anything we throw at you and still refuse to talk. So, here's what's going to happen. If you have not changed your mind by the time I finish my lunch, I'm leaving here. Pretty sure the Saudis are going to kill you about 5 minutes after I roll out that door. But at that point, I won't care. Like I said, we already know who financed your operation. The only thing I was sent here for was to see if there was any connection to the Kremlin, or if this was purely Ivan Romanov's operation. We know you were just a pawn and a tool. We just wanted to know if we needed to assassinate the Russian president along with Ivan. So, I'm going to eat my lunch, hoping the gravity of your situation sinks in at the last minute. If it does, and you can give me something to work with, I'll take you back to the U.S., where we're required to treat our prisoners more humanely. If not, I wash my hands of this whole thing and move on to my next assignment. The Saudis kill you, and we go and kill some Russians. Sound like a plan?" Nothing. Ismail was a rock. Maybe this wouldn't work after all. The sound of the door being unlocked informed Brett that his lunch had arrived. Brett rolled back and pivoted out of the way. A guard came through the opening, pushing a cart covered in a drab tablecloth. Brett had gone through the trouble of carefully orchestrating this next piece. Despite having claimed that Brett knew little of his adversary's past, he had a crafty little computer geek back home that could uncover just about anything across the internet. The pudgy kid was a genius when it came to cyber-crawling his way into a person's past. Because of this, Brett knew that Ismail had not always gone by that name. In fact, he had gone by many. Using one of those aliases, the terrorist first set foot on American soil as a college student, using an educational visa in his early 20s. He spent 4 years going to a small university in Kansas City, but never actually graduated with a degree. He had changed his major 3 times. Brett's sneaky hacker was able to figure out who Ismail hung out with via old social media posts and advanced facial recognition software. Ismail never owned any social media accounts himself, but the people he called friends did. They took pictures of themselves having a good time and posted them to the internet. Brett's geeky sleuth combed through the social profiles of every student in the university that would have been at school at the same time as Ismail, using his facial recognition software. Once discovered, Brett was able to paint a picture of the places they liked to hang out. One of those places had a reputation for barbecue. There was a total of 38 pictures, all taken at different times, that contained images of Izzy at the gatherings. And just like that, Brett had a plan of attack. As the door swung closed and latched on its own, the guard positioned the covered cart next to the table and pulled the tablecloth away. Stainless steel covers concealed the food, serving to keep the dishes they shrouded hot and ready. But while the food was still hiding underneath, the aroma could not be contained. The smell of roasted meats instantly filled the air, and Brett's stomach growled in response. The guard looked at the spread and shook his head. In his thick Arabic accent, he asked, "Is this really that good? Seems too much trouble for an enemy." Brett looked up at him and smiled. "Oh, this isn't for him. This is for me. I haven't been back home in a while. The FBI has had me bouncing all over the globe for a month now, and I have no idea when I'll be heading back. I flew all of this in for me." Brett lifted the lid to one of the plates. Steam bellowed out from under the thin metal cover, and he leaned in to take a deep whiff. "I'm sure you have your favorite meal," he told the guard. "Mine is barbecue. In my hometown, my dad was famous for his secret sauce. This isn't something my dad made. It came from a place in Washington, D.C. It's still pretty good, though. Send my thanks to the cooks who heated this up for me. It's as close to home as I can get right now." The guard nodded. "The cooks were concerned that some of this might be pork." Brett shook his head and gave the man a thumbs up. "I understand completely." He waved his hand over the feast. "All of this meat here is 100% grass-fed cow. No little piggies. I don't eat pork myself." The guard nodded again and looked at Ismail. "I thought you had this made for him. Is it not American tradition for a prisoner to get a last meal?" Brett nodded as he plucked a rib from the plate. "Indeed, but Izzy is not American." Brett began devouring the rib, delicately holding the sauce-covered treat between 2 fingers from each hand and pulling the meat from the bone with his teeth. The guard shook his head. "Good," the man said. "This man deserves no such privilege. He deserves only the death of a dog." In a flash movement that caught Brett by surprise, the guard stepped around the end of the table and leveled a blow at Ismail's face. Blood flew from his smashed lip, and the terrorist's head snapped around. Off the chair he twisted, wrists still tethering him in place to the top of the table, but the rest of him dangled out of view on the other side. The guard followed him over, punching him again and again. Brett shouted, and the guard responded instantly by ceasing his assault. "I said no more of that," Brett ordered. The guard stood over the crumpled Izzy, breathing heavily from his exertion. "We should finish him," the guard spat, not taking his eyes off Ismail. "I should finish him." "And the American government will not stand in your way or rebuke you for your actions," Brett barked. "But your prince agreed to allow me some time with him first. Unless you wish me to report your actions to the royal family, I suggest you stop what you're doing right now and leave us." For a moment, the big guard did not respond. He merely stood there, chest heaving, fist clenched, glaring at the terrorist. Finally, the man moved, reaching down to latch onto the fallen Izzy and haul him back into his chair. He backed away slowly, but kept his eyes on Ismail. Ismail stared back without emotion. "I pray that I am the one given the order to kill you." He then said something in Arabic, spat on the floor, and turned away. Without another word, he knocked on the door. The door clicked and the guard, his shirt wrinkled and disheveled from his efforts, exited the room. Brett sat staring at the door in stunned silence. This had not been part of the plan, but maybe it could still work in Brett's favor. "I am so sorry about that," Brett stated with convincing sincerity. "Do you need medical attention?" For the first time since Brett had arrived at this facility, Ismail responded. Until now, he had not said one word. "I am fine," he said, in perfect English. Brett blinked, unsure of how to proceed. "Why now?" he asked. "Why what?" "You've said nothing since we captured you in New York. Not a peep. Even once you were here, you have been beaten and waterboarded. But you said nothing. I could pretend to think that I have somehow gotten through to you, but you have proven to be far smarter than that. Why do you choose to break your silence now?" Izzy shrugged. "The end is near. One rethinks one's choices when he sees the end approaching. Maybe I choose to not go to the end of this life with my lips closed. Besides, what does it hurt me to simply tell you that I am fine?" Brett thought about that for a moment, then nodded. He reached for a piece of sliced brisket and dipped it into a bowl of thick, dark sauce. "For that matter, what would it hurt you to answer a few of my questions? Or at the very least admit to what we already know?" Brett popped the meaty morsel past his lips and started to chew. Ismail watched Brett's actions, eyes focused intently on the meat leaving the plate, being dunked in barbecue sauce, and vanishing into Brett's eager mouth. He swallowed as he looked up on Brett consuming his lunch for a few seconds before responding. "It would not hurt me at all. But you are my enemy. I don't wish to give you even the smallest of victories." Brett reached for the bowl of corn next. The trick here was to keep the man talking. Getting him to say anything was progress. But Brett had the sneaky suspicion that a game was being played. He caught the sense of chess pieces being moved around a board. He already knew that Izzy was a skilled master when it came to strategy. But Brett was a gamesman as well. He just needed to tread carefully. He dropped a dollop of softened butter into the bowl of steamed corn kernels. After dashing both salt and pepper on top from a couple of stainless shakers, he began to stir. "There is no victory here. Your war is over. You dealt us a blow, sure. You shed our blood on our own soil. You wounded us. But in the end, you were stopped short of achieving your goal. You won a few battles, but you lost the war. You're here. Your fight is over. In a few minutes, I will be leaving this place, and tomorrow the Saudis will likely just kill you, unless—" Ismail watched Brett shove spoonsful of corn into his mouth. He zeroed in on the plastic spoon as it dipped into the bowl and returned to Brett's lips again and again. "You make your show of kind offers," Ismail scoffed, eyes not on Brett's eyes, but his chewing mouth. "You tell me you are willing to move me back to the U.S., but they are lies. And even if you did, a prison is still a prison. I would rather die than live forever in a hole." Brett went back to the ribs, carefully choosing one of the larger ones. Brett nodded across the meat-covered bone held up between him and Ismail. "But not every hole is the same. What if I were to offer you incarceration away from other prisoners and outside of our normal legal system? What if you had access to television, a comfortable bed, and something more than a bucket to poop in? What if there was access to a mosque and respectable clothing?" He waved a rib over the food-laden cart. "What if we could offer you better meals than peanut butter sandwiches?" Ismail licked his lips. It wasn't an over-the-top motion, just a sort of pull-in of the lips and a barely visible showing of the tip of his tongue. But it was enough for Brett to notice. He was wearing Ismail down. In response, Brett let go of the rib with one hand and began sucking the extra sauce from the ends of his fingers with an audible smacking sound for effect. Ismail shook his head and dropped his gaze. In a softer, less committed tone, he said, "Lies. All lies. It's what you do. I'm not asking for you to tell us everything you know all up front. I'm asking for an arrangement between you and me. Give us something small. Anything at all to show your willingness to cooperate, and I can have you on a plane in a couple of hours. If at any point we fail to prove our willingness to make your life easier, you can shut your mouth. You'll head right back here, and the Saudis will give you a fitting warrior's death." Ismail kept his gaze low, seeming to weigh his options. Brett had seen it before. Few people were willing to give up their life when presented with a better choice. They started off brash and bold, making grandiose claims of defiance. But when truly faced with the end of their life, most began to waver in their commitment. Brett dropped the rib back onto the plate. "Tell you what, how about I do something right now to show you I'm making an honest offer? Call it a gesture of goodwill." Brett wiped the sauce from his hands with a napkin, and then turning to his right, began preparing a plate. He dished in mashed potatoes and gravy, a helping of corn, 4 ribs, and a few slices of brisket. Once completed, he set the plate on the table next to Ismail's shackles. "Not sure what you think of American barbecue, but I assure you, it has to be better than peanut butter on stale bread." Ismail stared at the plate for a moment and licked his lips again. This time he did it without trying to hide his hunger and desire. He looked up at Brett and nodded. Brett had been ready. Reaching down to his waist, he plucked a set of handcuffs from his belt. Even though his legs were useless, he still felt the need to adorn himself with the tools of the job. This included his service Glock, 2 spare mags, and a set of handcuffs. Though his weapon had to be surrendered before being allowed to enter this facility, he still had the silver bracelets. Leaning back across the table, he attached one cuff to the steel circle bolted to the center of the table. The other, he wrapped around the left wrist of Ismail. Once firmly in place, he fished his handcuff key from his satchel hanging from the corner of the wheelchair. He uncuffed the terrorist from the set the man had already been attached to. This now left Izzy with his right arm free, and his left anchored to the table by Brett's own handcuffs. Ismail did not wait for permission, nor did he even ask for utensils. He snatched up a slab of brisket with his free hand and began cramming it into his mouth with vigor, poking his cheeks out like a chipmunk storing nuts. As he chewed, his mouth was so stuffed with the delicious meat that he could not even keep his lips closed. Brett leaned back and watched the man fill himself with gusto, heaving food into himself with great speed, gulping it down while being only partially chewed. It was like the terrorist was concerned that Brett might take back the generous offer at any second and return him to a life of peanut butter and dry bread. Both the corn and mashed potatoes went in the same way, scooped up between 2 fingers and shoveled into his eager maw with rabid obsession. Gravy, corn, and barbecue sauce dripped everywhere and began to litter the front of the man's scraggly beard and shirt with debris. It was gross and difficult to watch, and Brett had to force himself to act like the whole scene was not revolting. He said nothing the whole time he looked on, allowing the man the privilege of his meal. Brett was patient, not because he wanted to be, but because he needed information. He was playing the long game here, focusing on the prize at the end. Brett's anger bubbled just below the surface. He knew who and what the man was, knew his horrific acts of violence and the deaths that were because of him. Brett lost one of his own agents to the monster. He nearly lost 2 others. In truth, Brett would like nothing more than to leap from the table, grab handfuls of brisket, and shove fistfuls of the stuff into the killer's mouth, suffocating him on American goodness. Oh, but that's right. He couldn't leap anywhere. He was chained to this chair, much the same way Ismail was chained to the table. If there was anything Brett hated worse than the terrorist shoving food down his throat across from him, it was this stupid chair. The man finished off the plate, and then looked at Brett with the sorrow-filled eyes of a petulant child, silently begging for another piece of candy. Brett smiled at him. "You want another?" Ismail said nothing, just nodded. Brett kept the smile painted on his face, trying to emulate the sincerity he knew he must portray, despite the burning anger in his heart. He turned to the cart once more, and began refilling the plate with equal helpings of everything. "Now that I've shown you my seriousness in wanting to negotiate a better existence for you, why not give me something? Anything. Tell me something I already know anyway. Confirm a few suspicions for me. We can end this whole ordeal," Brett said. dishing out helpings onto the plate. "Work with us, and I can make sure you are comfortable anywhere else but here." "Why not tell you something you have not asked about?" Ismail quietly offered. "To prove my value." Brett held his gaze on his plate-filling task, resisting the urge to turn around and look at Ismail in the eye, lest he give away his satisfaction at having broken the terrorist's will. "Like what?" Brett asked. In ominous tones charged with malice, Ismail said, "Like who it was that provided the information that Special Agent in Charge Brett Allen Foster was going to be coming here." Brett froze. Adrenaline flooded his system in a heated rush that raced up his spine and set his fingers tingling. He had been played. He had somehow fallen into the terrorist's web of deceit. This whole time, Brett had thought he had been wearing the man down, but the truth was much more sinister. Ismail had simply been waiting for the right moment to make this statement. For some reason, that moment was now. But why? It had to be for more than the prospect of a plate of American barbecue. He jerked his head towards Ismail. Brett's eyes no longer struggled to hide his anger and loathing. He was going to let that guard back in to beat the man to death. A set of the vilest and most offensive swear words readied themselves on his lips, intent on catapulting them in Ismail's direction. And then they just hung there, unspoken. Brett was in serious trouble. Ismail stood up. Brett's handcuffs dangled from one hand, useless and not attached to anything. The other held up a handcuff key for Brett to see. It took only a nanosecond for his brain to register what had happened. The guard that had come in, the very same one that had attacked Ismail, had used that moment to tuck the tiny key somewhere on Ismail's person. The statement the guard had made in Arabic must have been to confirm to Ismail what had really been done. Brett had then made it possible for the terrorist to retrieve the key when he had released one of the man's arms to allow the man to feed himself. Then, when Brett turned away to fill a second plate, Izzy released his bonds. There could only be one reason why he would risk such a move now. Brett thought to call out for help, but he had no chance. Ismail was lunging for him across the table, murder and rage and inferno in his eyes. Abby sat perched in her hospital bed in Jasper, Texas, staring at her phone for the 5th time. Her brows were furrowed in a worried thought. DJ was not responding to any of her texts or phone calls. He had left her hours ago, fresh from his trip to visit Marion Peters' mother. It was an attempt to make amends with DJ's guilty conscience by making sure the woman was properly cared for financially. Abigail had said nothing about the trip. She knew the act would not fix the problems going on between DJ's ears. But it was a kind and just move on her husband's part, so she did nothing to interfere. Nor had she yet done anything to try to talk to him about the demons that were plaguing his sleep. She had been giving him the opportunity to work through the issues on his own. Men seemed to need that space after the loss of a comrade to armed combat. She had secretly been reading about soldiers and policemen dealing with PTSD. Some were successful in sorting through the issues well enough that they were able to adjust and move on with their lives with little assistance from outside sources. The vast majority of them, however, needed to talk it out and get advice from seasoned counselors. But none of them did so immediately. They seemed to need some space to try to work it out on their own first. Even if they could not come to terms with their issues, they at least needed the opportunity to organize their thoughts and figure out what those issues really were, or to at least get them started down that path. She was sure it had something to do with the male ego. The trick was trying to decide when DJ had been given enough space and it was time to step in with an intervention. If she let him go too long, he could have a meltdown and do something to hurt himself. Worse, he could suffer a breakdown in rational thinking and take his frustrations out on others. With someone of DJ's size and history of taking the lives of others, justified as they were, that could be a very bad thing. DJ was a hand grenade with the pin pulled. Right now, he was trying to figure out how to reinsert the pin. If he failed, or if Abby waited too long in getting him the help he needed to make that happen, there would be a violent eruption of bloody consequence. As she reclined in her hospital bed, one hand resting on the small baby bump at her midsection, the other holding her phone. She worried that may have already happened. She was looking at a small blue dot in the middle of a satellite image of her property, the home that DJ had been preparing for them. The dot was located behind the house, somewhere in the woods between the house and the small gun range carved out in the middle of the trees. It had not moved in a while. At first, she assumed that the tracking was just off because of the dense pine trees interfering with the GPS tracking on the phone. But DJ was not responding to her texts or calls, and it was now past sundown. The range did not have any electricity. He wouldn't have any ability to continue his shooting drills in the dark. Plus, in this part of Texas, the mosquitoes would be bad right now. Something was wrong. She knew it. And with that knowledge came a fear that crept up on her out of the darkness of her imagination. She swiped the satellite image away and navigated to her contacts list. She needed an assist. If she was wrong, and she prayed that she was going to hear about it from an angry DJ who had proclaimed that he did not want to see or hear from any of his coworkers ever again. He didn't want the reminder of everything that had gone on, he told her. But she didn't know who else to trust. She stabbed at a selection on her screen and placed the phone up to her ear. It was answered on the second ring. "Abby," Agent Bradford Cashin asked in curious tones. "How are you? How's the baby?" "Fine, Cash. I'm on track to get out of here next week. But I need a favor, and it's a big one." She explained her worry. She told him of the nightmares her husband was having, and how she was sure he was suffering from PTSD. She explained how she had given him space up to this point, but now she was concerned that she had allowed it to go on so long. DJ wasn't answering her calls or texts, and the little blip on her phone showed him to be unmoving. Would Cash be willing to go check on him? Was he even in town and able to help? Before she and DJ had left the FBI, Agent Cash had been issued the title of Acting Assistant Special Agent in Charge. While their group was not large enough to warrant an official position and title for an ASAC, Brett recognized that he would need someone acting as a go-to person if he were away on business, vacation, or otherwise unreachable. That person was Agent Cash. With that title, he was one of the few people afforded the privilege to leave their secret base. This was one of the reasons Abby decided that Cash was a better person to call rather than Brett. DJ loved Brett like a brother, but brothers sometimes fought, and right now, for reasons she did not understand, DJ harbored some anger for Brett. SAC Foster was not the person DJ needed to be seeing right now. No, Cash was the better choice. Thankfully, Cash was in town. In fact, before she had even asked her favor, and while she had continued to unload on him with all her worry and concern, Cash had already left the base and was on his way before she even posed the question. 20 minutes, he told her. Cash would be on site in 20 minutes, and Argo was riding shotgun. She smiled when she heard the name. Cash and Argo were like family to DJ, despite her husband's claims of never wanting to see them again. They had been through a lot together, life and death sort of stuff. There was a bond between the three of them because of those circumstances. And while DJ claimed that seeing any of them would be a hard reminder of the past he was trying to leave behind, she knew that if DJ really was on the brink of putting a gun in his mouth, it would be those two who could talk him down off the ledge. They were brothers, all of them. She just hoped she had not waited too long to finally do something. Cash hung up, promising to call as soon as he was on site and had figured out what was going on. It was possible, Cash explained, that DJ had simply lost the phone in the woods. They didn't have a landline or internet out there. DJ would not even have been able to send her a reassuring email. Regardless, Cash was sure the man was fine. As he hung up with her, Abby had a knot in her stomach that was arguing with his logic. Something was wrong. She could feel it. The door to her room opened, distracting her from worry. An orderly was pushing a wheelchair with a cordial smile on his face. "Abby Slaughter, right?" the big man asked. He was a good-looking guy with broad shoulders and a towering build. His blonde hair was well-groomed, and he had piercing blue eyes perfectly placed into his chiseled face. Here was a man that enjoyed the gym. It wasn't that Abby was attracted to him, of course. It was just that she was a woman, and she acknowledged a handsome man when she saw one. And this guy was a pure Adonis. He should be on the pages of magazines, selling women things they might not have otherwise considered, instead of pushing a wheelchair around a hospital. "That would be me," she confirmed with a sigh. "What's up?" "I'm your ride, of course," he said, while gesturing to the wheelchair. She shook her head, confused. "Where are we going?" The giant, blonde-headed model cocked his head. "Your MRI, of course. Don't tell me you forgot." "I forgot nothing," she scowled. "No one told me I had an MRI scheduled. And why so late?" The orderly shrugged. "Hey, I just take orders around here. I'm not included in the decision-making process. I know you were probably looking forward to the great hospital cuisine we have set up for supper, but I'm afraid it's going to have to wait. Doc wants to get some updated pictures of the baby." He happily pushed the chair around and perched it next to the bed, locking the wheels. "Here, let me help you. Take hold of my arm." Abby grudgingly allowed the man to help her into the chair, but this wasn't exactly good timing. She was waiting on the call from Cash and Argo once they arrived at the house. "How long will this take?" she asked. "I don't know. Maybe 20 minutes. It'll go quick once we get you strapped in." "I'm waiting for an important phone call," she argued. "Speaking of your phone," the man pointed at the small device clutched in her hands. "You're going to have to leave that here." "Not going to happen, sunshine," Abby snapped. "But let me lay it out for you so you know who's really in charge here. I'll take your little trip and get all set up to get this scan done. But this phone stays with me, and we wait to proceed until I get my phone call. After that, I will follow all your orders like a good little girl. Until then, I'm the one calling the shots. Got it?" The orderly looked at her with amusement and crossed his arms, considering. "Fine. We'll play it your way. They told me you weren't the best patient to deal with. They told me you could be feisty." He stepped around the back of the chair, unlocked the wheels, and rolled her out of the open door. They took a turn to the right and started down the empty hallway. The place was quiet. Patients were settling in for the night, she guessed. There wasn't even anyone at the nurse's station by the elevator. She assumed they must be checking on someone. It wasn't until she chanced a glance at a security camera facing the elevator, an elevator they happened to roll right past, despite the MRI room being stationed one floor below, that the first red flag began to wave itself in the back of her consciousness. The camera was an older one, not one of those models concealed in a plastic dome. It was exposed and mounted to a metal arm near the ceiling. It was unplugged, the coaxial cable dangling from the ceiling just a few inches away. Her worry over her husband took a sudden shift. Gone was the hideous thought that the man might have blown his brains out. Her violent past conjured up a fresh new belief. DJ had been attacked, probably by the same supermodel that was casually pushing her down this empty hallway. She hadn't made the connection on who was making a move on them yet, but that wasn't her priority. Getting herself out of this predicament was. She turned her head and tried to look up at the fake orderly. "I haven't had an MRI yet," she told the man. "Where is this thing?" "Just down the end of the hallway," he replied casually. She looked further down the hallway and could see a sign hanging off the wall. Squinting, she could just make it out. The sign said, "Stairs." So that was the plan. He would get her to the stairs and then make his move. She would be vulnerable with him standing above and behind. He was probably going to stab her with a needle, or maybe dose her with sodium pentothal. Regardless, she could not wait. She had to change things up. She needed to make her move now. First, she casually awakened the screen on her phone, pretending to mindlessly surf social media, like so many others were wont to do when trying to occupy time. Then, after a moment, she deftly swiped to a previous screen and tapped the phone to redial Cash. Quickly, before her would-be captor noticed that she was making a call, she flipped the phone over and tucked it into the pocket of her robe. She twisted to look up at the big guy, reaching with her right hand to pat his. He looked at her with mild surprise. She winked. "Thank you for being so understanding," she demurred. Quick as thought, she squeezed the man's fingers and rotated out of the chair to stand on her feet, ripping the orderly's hand away from the wheelchair, flipping it over in a well-practiced wrist twist. Her goal was to snap the man's fingers and hit him with enough pain as to make him vulnerable to her next attack. But he was simply too strong. She gained a momentary surprise, but he quickly recovered. He stepped in, grabbed her wrist, and before she even realized what was happening, was flipping through the air to land on the hard floor with a thud. Her vision tunneled, and her breath left her in a rush. The man was suddenly kneeling over her, pressing a wet cloth over her mouth and nose. She instantly resisted the overwhelming urge to suck in, knowing it would be lights out if she did. Instead, she latched on to her assailant's wrist with both hands and used that leverage to pull her legs up and around his neck in a scissor pinch. She twisted out from under the cloth and tried to bend his wrist back again. The big bruiser was just too strong. With seemingly little effort, he stood and lifted her high into the air like she weighed nothing. With a grunt, he slammed her back down, using his own powerful arms and gravity to assist. She did black out then. The hospital hallway vanished in a slow fade. Her last thoughts were on her failure and what that could mean to her unborn child. She just hoped that she had given Cash and Argo enough information to figure out what was going on. They would save her and her baby. They would save DJ. It's what they did. And then she was gone, taking a long plunge into the darkness of unconsciousness.